chair really is that squeaky. Hey there, this is Foggy Fiction, and I am Haley. I'm a writer living with mental illness, doing my best to show that mental health does not dictate talent or worth, and hoping to encourage others to chase their dreams. So you're writing about someone who has PTSD not related to combat. I happen to have PTSD, and I'm totally willing to talk about it. Let's get to it. So first thing, a person can get PTSD for a multitude of reasons, not just war. And it isn't always just one thing that can give a person PTSD either. I was a passenger in a fatal car accident when I was 17, my best friend, whose birthday is today actually, being the fatality. I had a traumatic brain injury, among other problems that included partial paralysis of the left side of my body. 6 months later, I watched my mother die, having succumbed to a simple illness after surviving cancer. A few years later, I found myself in an abusive relationship that I couldn't see or accept was abusive until several months after he died in a car accident. I am 29 years old now, and I have PTSD. So if you're writing a character who has experienced any sort of event that would be traumatic to them, they can have PTSD. The second thing, though some of my symptoms did start fairly immediately, my therapist told me that a diagnosis of PTSD cannot accurately be made until at least a month has passed. It is also my understanding that the symptoms need to be clearly interfering with a person's life. My official diagnosis was made just a few years ago when I started seeing my first therapist. So in my case, I didn't get a diagnosis until almost 10 years after the first traumatic event. So if you're writing a character who experiences their traumatic event during the course of the story that you are writing, I wouldn't recommend slapping a PTSD diagnosis on them right away, even if they do start exhibiting symptoms early on. And if you're writing a book or series where a character experienced a traumatic event years earlier, it's perfectly fine to write about their diagnosis occurring now as opposed to back then. The third thing, what symptoms do I experience? There are a wide variety of symptoms that a person diagnosed with PTSD might experience. Looking over any given list you can find with a quick Google search, I've been through several of them, many of which are common symptoms among other mental health disorders I have been diagnosed with too. Of those symptoms, though, the ones that stand out the most are these. Nightmares. Immediately following my car accident, I had nightmares every time I fell asleep for months. When my mom passed, the nightmares began to include her. And the same when my ex died. While I still occasionally have nightmares about my best friend and my mother, the ones that I have about my ex are the worst ones. They have me violently waking up, out of breath, and with a cold sweat. Intrusive thoughts. I have them in general, but the worst and most prevalent ones concern my intense fear of death. Multiple times a day, every day. Trouble sleeping or insomnia. There are some nights that I'm so afraid that I won't wake up that I actually cry myself into exhaustion before I can fall asleep because I keep violently jerking myself back awake. Thankfully, those nights aren't often, but I do have difficulty getting to sleep in general. And that's because I have a hard time being alone with my own mind. Probably because of those intrusive thoughts. Out-of-body sensation or derealization. It most often occurs when I'm experiencing an anxiety or panic attack, but I notice myself feeling like I'm in the backseat of my own mind. Like I'm watching things on a screen inside my head. The constant need to stay busy. This is also one of my techniques that I use to distract myself when I'm feeling anxious or panicky, but it's honestly true in general and has a lot to do with my difficulty sleeping. I do feel like I need to constantly be doing something, usually multiple things at once. For example, I have a hard time just watching a movie and feel like I need to be doing something like crocheting or writing or playing games while I watch. General avoidance of things related to my traumas, including argumentative situations and driving in places I am not familiar with. If I'm not able to avoid them, I become panicky and experience physical symptoms such as cold sweat, nausea, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. This can lead to an anxiety or panic attack. Hypervigilance. I am always aware of what the worst case scenario in any given situation might be, and worry about it happening. It feels like I'm always preparing myself for the worst because the worst has actually happened to me before. I worry about things a lot, like pretty constantly, and at times I have even become paranoid, and that's a tough thing to admit. Anger. While I don't find myself in violent fits of anger, I do get much more easily frustrated and aggravated now than I did prior to my accident. And of course, PTSD has also been linked to other mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, both of which I am also diagnosed with. And a lot of those symptoms overlap. I also want to mention that I do suffer from survivor's guilt, which my research shows is often associated with PTSD. While some of my symptoms started occurring rather immediately, such as the nightmares, others, like the derealization and anxiety, didn't appear until about 4 years later. There truly are so many symptoms, and only you can know which ones are right for your character. As I said, I didn't even list all of the ones that I experienced, mostly because a lot of them overlap with anxiety, and I mentioned those in the last video. I encourage you to do some research on PTSD, its symptoms, and people who have experienced an event like the one or ones that your character has, and go from there. My biggest piece of advice on this note is to not think that everyone with PTSD is going to be experiencing horrific flashbacks like the ones you see in movies. That's not everyone's experience. It's not mine. The third thing I want to talk about, how does it affect my life? If you watch my video on writing a character with anxiety or panic disorder, then you already know a little of my answer to this question. I am able to hold a steady job and I do have a healthy relationship. I'm not saying that my mental health does not affect these things though. I intentionally work part-time in an area of town that I am comfortable driving in. I generally work smaller shifts, and I like that my job is repetitive because that means I know my tasks and responsibilities, and there generally aren't any surprises on that front. My boyfriend and I have been together for more than 7 years, and he met me after my traumas. Just a few months after I started experiencing anxiety and panic attacks before I knew what was happening with my mind. And it hasn't been easy. I feel incredibly lucky to have him on this journey with me because yes, he is on this journey too. He sees me at my best and at my worst. He's held me through the tears and the moments where he had to convince me that I wasn't dying because I couldn't convince myself. He's been through it all with me. I also have separation anxiety due to the losses that I experienced in such a short amount of time. We have a healthy relationship. It's about as normal as it can be with mental illness in the mix. But we're not walking on eggshells with each other. We have tough conversations when we need to, and he accepts the fact that I literally check to make sure he's breathing before I leave for work. So when you're writing your character, you can absolutely write that they have a steady job and a good relationship while living with PTSD. I'm proof that it can happen. But I also remember a time when I couldn't work, couldn't even leave the house by myself, and I have a list of exes that I was too much for. So I can't say that I was always able to work and hold a relationship. Which means that if you've written a character with PTSD who struggles with those things, that's normal too. I say this a lot in these videos, but it's still true. Only you can know what's right for your character and their story. I just don't want you to feel like you have to write it one way just because that's the only way you tend to see it portrayed in film and fiction. The fourth thing I'm only going to touch on briefly because it's another one that I covered in the last video, and that is how do I cope with my PTSD. I use the same coping mechanisms here that I do with my anxiety, the main one being distraction and keeping myself busy. When I'm at home, I'm usually taking in some sort of film or media while also writing, crocheting, or playing video games. If I do end up experiencing anxiety or panic attack, I use the distractions I mentioned in the last video for those, my favorite of which is making alphabetical lists. Again, it's a form of distraction. I also do one of those things I mentioned in my symptoms as a form of coping, and that's avoidance, which is not a good coping mechanism, but I'm still working on facing some of these things, so one step at a time. A few examples. I try to avoid medication because I'm afraid it's going to kill me, and I don't drive in places that I'm not comfortable with or haven't driven in before, unless they're absolutely necessary. And when I am put in a situation where I have to do these things, it is very difficult. It took me months just to be able to take my birth control, and it took me years to drive as far away from the house as I can now. A lot of anxiety and panic attacks went into these things. But you know what? To quote my comfort show, the journey continues. And for me, that journey is every day, one difficult step at a time. I also went through EMDR therapy or EMDR trauma therapy, having completed it in February of this year, and I can see how much of a difference it has made. Looking at myself now compared to when I started that, miles of progress. And if you want more info on EMDR therapy and my journey with it, I did a video on that recently too. I was seeing a regular therapist even before doing EMDR, and I do intend to go back to that as soon as I am able to. Therapy is definitely something that I think helps me. Everyone is different. And more importantly on this topic, every person's story is different. So say it with me, people. Only you can know what is right for your character and their story. I recommend researching experiences like the one you're writing and seeing what among those things you find click for your character. And the last thing that I want to cover is, most people don't know that I have PTSD until I tell them. So for me anyway, this is mostly an invisible illness. There isn't a lot of media out there representing people who have PTSD that isn't related to combat. Most people have this image in their head of PTSD being such a visibly noticeable thing because of the way that they've seen it in movies and on TV, but that's not always the case. But I can tell you that I never miss the surprise in people's faces the first time they hear me mention that I have PTSD, even if they've already seen my anxiety and panic attacks firsthand. Your character's PTSD is not a fashion statement. Let me rephrase that. Mental illness is not a fashion statement. It doesn't have to be visible. You don't have to write like there's a neon sign on your character's forehead alerting to the people around them. And I'm not saying you're wrong if you're writing your character's PTSD to be obvious or noticeable. For some people, that is reality. But if you are writing a character whose PTSD is not obvious to anyone and you're wondering if that makes sense, it does for me. So that's it. If you're writing a character who has PTSD not related to combat, as I cannot speak on that front, and we're wondering any of these things, I hope I answered your questions. If you have any questions that I didn't cover, please ask them in the comments below. Like this video if you enjoyed it. This is a series that I am doing and there will be more videos to come, so definitely subscribe if you're interested in following that or my very clumsy journey as a writer living with mental illness. Enjoy the happy moments.